Our first guest speaker today is Dr. Rohan Kedar. He was part of our church, and I've heard him speak on other topics, and I just love the way he speaks, so I asked him to come. He is a doctor of psychiatry over in Wayne's, St. Mary's on the east side, and he came over here to speak with us today. So I will yield to him. Thank you.
Hello? Testing? You guys can hear me? Great to see everybody. This is my first time back in Kalamazoo since leaving for residency. So like Lori said, I am a psychiatry resident at St. Mary Mercy, which is in Livonia. I'm in my second year, which is kind of where it picks up a bit. I trained here at Western Michigan for med school. I see one of the psychiatrists who I rounded with, so thanks. I love psychiatry and love helping people with depression. So just to start out, I'm going to explain what depression is, kind of go through what the causes are, and that's kind of the focus. Treatment options, other things like adverse childhood events, all that stuff is going to be discussed with later speakers, so I won't dive into that as much. And just to clarify, this is going to be just a very general discussion about depression. I'm not going to be diving into too many minute details. I'm trying to keep it less medical, though there might be some medical speak in there, but I'll try to explain it as best I can. And yeah, we'll go from there. So in all medical presentations, we have to say no financial disclosures. I'm not in the pocket of Big Pharma or anything, but I did have a baby girl, so I thought I'd include that there. Yeah. So she was born on January 15th. Doing really well. Dorothy's doing really well. I know a lot of you know her, and yeah, it's been fun. I'm a little tired, but it's lots of fun. So yeah, so covering today what is depression, kind of some quick facts about it, and then kind of discussing the causes of depression. So let's get to it. So the general, I figured, okay, let's do the Merriam-Webster definition first. A state of feeling sad. Not very descriptive. Then they kind of dive into the symptoms, which we'll discuss on the next slide. And another definition I thought was interesting, a lowering of physical or mental vitality of functional activity. So activity being low, which is one of the symptoms of depression, but these are kind of the general definitions. There are other ones, but those were not related to mood. So then, how do psychiatrists think of depression? What are the things that we look for? So we go by the DSM-5, which is the most updated version of how we think of what is, like if we were to look for what group of symptoms do we need to look for to see what is depression. So here's kind of the breakdown. We look for 5 of the following symptoms, and it has to be for around 2 weeks having these symptoms for more days than not. So low depressed mood, defined as low mood, feeling sad, so on and so forth. Then we have just generally observed by other people, either feeling very agitated, antsy is a word you could use, or just looking like people are physically slower. Like if you think about a depressed person, they're actually like talking slower maybe, or just seem like they are moving through molasses is another way to think about it. Diminished interest in activities, so what we in the medical field called anhedonia, but really, you know, I'm interested in video games, I'm interested in hanging out with friends, I generally go out, and when people are in depressed moods, they generally don't do that. Fatigue, loss of energy, feeling very exhausted, even if they're doing the same things that they normally do, they're not like working out a ton or anything, they still just feel zonked out. The weight loss or weight gain or changes in appetite, they're either not eating that much, just very eating like little birds, or eating too much. So it can be swing either way. Feelings of worthlessness or excessive or an inappropriate guilt. So if you stole your friend's cookies and feel guilty about that, that's appropriate guilt. But maybe you had a conversation with someone and now you just feel so guilty. Oh, what if I made them feel terrible? Just like all this guilt out of nowhere without a reasonable cause for it. Insomnia or hypersomnia, meaning you're either sleeping too little or sleeping all day. So it can swing either way, just kind of like with the appetite. You can not be sleeping at all, getting 2 to 3 hours of sleep, or you can be sleeping all day. The classic image of someone depressed is they're sleeping all day, but it could be the other way around as well. So you can't really concentrate, can't really think like you normally could, and then recurrent thoughts of death or suicide. So pretty straightforward there. If you're thinking about killing yourself, you're probably having some sort of depression. Now, when we think about all these, it's 5 or more, and you have to have at least the depressed mood or the loss of interest in things. So those are the two one of those two have to be there, and then you have to have at least 5 of these to be clinically diagnosed with major depressive disorder. There's other depressive disorders, but these are the ones that we look for when we think of the classic depression. So there's other things that we have to consider when we consider depression. For example, when I was on nights, work during residency, I probably had a lot of these things. I wasn't interested in doing anything but sleeping. I was having terrible sleep because my schedule was all flipped. Wasn't eating very well, very tired all the time, wasn't able to concentrate as well. So I fit a lot of these things, but I did not have the impairment. I was not functioning at a lesser level. I was still able to do my job, still able to, laugh with people, still able to carry out my normal function, even though it was at night instead of at day. So I wouldn't have been able to fit that diagnosis of depression. But people who are experiencing the symptoms and also noticing that they're not able to be in social circles, not able to do their job, not able to generally function as well. That's one thing you have to have. So another thing that can't be the cause of substances, of medical problems, things like that. So for example, if you look at these, again, not to go too morbid, but like a cancer patient, for example, they could fit a lot of these things and not necessarily be depressed. So it's another thing to consider. Though you can have depression with cancer, so a little difficult to distinguish there, but just for example, there isn't a reason for it. People who drink alcohol, that's a depressant. So if they're feeling depressed when they're drinking, or if they're using alcohol a lot, that could be another example of someone who has this low mood, but then there's a reason. A little nuanced, and they can still experience all these dysfunctions, but not classically a major depressive disorder. We call that either substance-induced or unspecified. And then the other major thing is that a lot of people think of, a lot of people could have bipolar disorder, which is a distinguishing feature from just a regular depression, because they kind of have ups and downs, defined as mania when they're up and depression when they're down. So they can actually experience similar depression, but the treatment options are different, which I know is going to be covered in the next time. And then there's all these ways we classify it. So mild, moderate, severe. Is this the first time or multiple times? We don't have to dive too much into these. But just up there, you guys can ask questions later if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty. So when we think about depression, we can, like I was saying before, there could be other causes. So what are some alternatives? So the bipolar disorder I already mentioned, and then there's other ways to think of it. But with psychiatric illness, a lot of things can be intertwined. For example, anxiety disorders are very common with depression. So unfortunately, if you're depressed, you can also be very anxious about everything, which doesn't help with any of the social stuff that you do, things like that. There could be a lot of trauma in your past, and that could affect your mood now, and that could be part of a PTSD type thing. And you can also have depression, or it could be PTSD looking similar to depression. You can even have something as simple as a sleep disorder, which could really make you have a terrible mood all the time because you're not sleeping well, things like that. So there's many possibilities of what depression is. And treatment options, the reason I'm diving into the nitty-gritty for these is that treatment options can look differently. If it's primarily a sleep disorder, you get sleep under control, the rest of the stuff can get fixed. If it's substance use or abuse, you can get treatment for that, and that might help with your mood. Now, all these things can also be presenting together, so that could mean you have to explore multiple avenues. But the thing to understand is that depression doesn't just have one cause. We're not talking about like, okay, you have depression, this is exactly what's going on. There's a lot of things, a lot of factors that go into it, and a lot of other things that could be occurring that can worsen your symptoms. So it's kind of some quick facts that we have here. In 2010, the estimated cost of depression, just of the major depression, not any of those other stuff that I was mentioning, like the bipolar disorder, substance abuse. So major depressive disorder, unipolar depression, $200 billion in the US. So if you think that depression's not real, well, we have some facts that say yes, it is real, and it does impact people. It does cause, this is including treatment, this is including loss in ability to work, things like that. So it has a huge impact. And the lifetime prevalence, meaning that if you look at someone's entire life, 18% of people are going to experience either major depressive or persistent depressive disorder. Persistent depressive disorder meaning that it lasts for a longer period of time, maybe not as severe of symptoms, but still kind of what we would describe as being in a depressed mood. So 18%, and that was gathered in 2010. So the likelihood that someone, 1 in 5 people, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, one of you will have a depressive episode or a persistent time of depression in your life. So we put it that way, that's a lot of people. And more likely to be in females, Caucasians, but it's more debilitating in minorities. Younger population, and it tends to decrease with age, but it can happen, especially with some loss that can happen. Hello? Okay, it's still working. And then chronically ill patients, for understandable reasons. So a lot of the information I'm getting is from a source called Up to Date, which gathers a bunch of articles from doctors' research and kind of consolidates it into a nice, easy to understand and easy to explain. And they had a quote up here that I thought was great. So depression likely represents a group of heterogeneous disorders that are phenotypically similar. To break that down, so a bunch of different disorders that all look about the same. So like I was saying, depression has lots of causes. Depression can thus be considered the final common pathway of the different disease processes that occur across a biopsychosocial continuum, which is a fancy way to say that there's things that can happen, within your body that's causing it. So stuff like you could have genetically predisposed, you could have some physical ailment that is causing a depressed mood. There could also be how you think, how your mind is processing information, how you're interacting with people, and what the actual thought processes in your mind can affect it. And then your social and environment, what people are saying to you, what your environment is it healthy, is it got the structure for it. All these things culminate together into something that can look like depression. So when we're saying, this person has everything right in their life, but they're depressed, that could be because they're genetically predisposed to it. Their parents had it, they have some sort of deficit in receptors or the way their neurons are firing that could be causing the depression. Or it could just be, you have those friends who, whatever you say to them, negative thoughts. Oh, you're so pretty. Oh, I'm not as pretty as you. Just take the compliment. These are, there's a lot of those negative talk that people have that could be fed by also the environment. I know that a lot of, at least according to the females in my life, there's a lot of negative talk to girls' bodies, and then if people are processing that when they're young, and then when they emerge out of that, when they could have all these negative thought patterns, like, okay, I'm not as like this, and I don't look like her, I'm not as skinny as her, I'm not as pretty as her, and that could cause a negative image of yourself, leading to lower self-esteem, more predisposed to depression. Someone says something to you, and then you could feel terrible for weeks. So all these things play into something that can look like depression, matching all those symptoms that I talked about earlier. Oh, that's not it. Okay, so when we talk about general risk factors, I'm not going to read the entire list, but things I'd like to point out. So I said genetics, there is some correlation within families. Now, that could be with the biologic thing, but also keep in mind that people who live with people who have depression or other mental illness can also have that kind of environment factor being in there. I know that the ACE score, the Adverse Childhood Events, are about to be discussed with another speaker, and actually having a family with a severe mental illness is one of those risk factors, and I'll let that speaker explain that further, but that is something that can affect you both in the biosphere and also in the environment sphere. The greatest risk factor for having depression is a previous depressive episode. So if you had it once, you're more likely to have it again, especially if you're not keeping up with treatments. All my patients who come back to the mental health unit, they always go, well, most of them, I shouldn't say all of them. Some of them are good and take their medications, but they're like, oh, I was doing great, so I didn't take my medications. Yeah. Oh, I was doing great with the therapy, but then I stopped it because I thought I didn't need it. It's like, well, maybe you should have continued a little bit longer because you're back here, but we'll still take care of you. Substance misuse, like I was mentioning before, that can really cause things. So that could be things like alcohol, illicit drugs, any sort of, even, if you're using things inappropriately to cope. These are things to consider. And then if you look at kind of the adversity, like I said, someone else is going to be kind of diving into what it means during childhood, but you could be going along fine, but if you lose, let's just say you lose your parents, biggest support you've had, and then go through a lot of other stressful things, that could trigger a major depressive episode. Marital problems, divorce, people tend to try to trivialize this in both, within their own marriage, or if your parents go through that, things like that. It does affect people. They do have some consequences in terms of mood. So when we dive into the physiologic aspects, so there's the genetics part. So you could have variations in parts of your genome. You can have variations in how you respond to stress, and you can have variations in response to medications. The medications part, actually, they're starting to investigate testing for genetics into how you respond to medications. We've had mixed results with using that information on our mental health unit, but it is there, and insurance companies are starting to pay for that a little bit, so something to consider for treatment. But when we talk about stress response, so have people heard of cortisol? It's kind of the stress. So elevated levels of cortisol for prolonged periods of time can tax the body, so your body might physiologically respond to stress differently than other people. When we talk about the genome, I'm not going to dive in too much into what specifically we're talking about, but just know that you can be genetically predisposed to depression. Now, when we talk about epigenetics, this is how the body expresses genomes. So you have the DNA, but you don't necessarily express it. Your body doesn't say, hey, do this thing that the genome is saying. So epigenetics means that the body says, hey, activate this or don't activate this. And that looks differently, and there's a lot of investigation into what that means for not just depression and psychiatric disorders, but all of medicine is very interested in epigenetics, because if you can affect how the body responds to things, there's a lot of treatment options for that, but that's something to consider. Shortened telomeres, when you think about DNA aging, you're talking about the telomeres, so if they're getting shorter, that means your DNA is aging, which could potentially affect your mood. And then neurotransmitters, which means all the things that we target with our medications, such as dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, things like that. The things that our meds affect, those are things that could be different, and you could have lower amounts, your body doesn't process it properly whatever. So a lot of the treatment options are trying to boost some of these or block some of the activities of these neurotransmitters. Not trying to get too scientific here, so we'll just leave it at that. Then other ways, the way your brain synapses fire, not going to dive into what each one is, but those could be either hyperactive, which means like that could lead to ruminating thoughts, which are just thoughts that keep occurring in your head, especially negative thoughts. So that could be something. You could have anatomic changes in the brain, and some of this stuff could be kind of a chicken and egg thing, where you depressed and started having these changes, or did you have these changes and it looks like depression when you have these changes. So keep that in mind, that sometimes depression will actually lead to these subtle changes in your brain. So you could have changes in your brain, certain parts of your brains could be thinner or smaller than what you would expect. Pruning, which is just like pruning a plant, your brain does, especially in adolescence, actually prune part of your brain to make it as your brain is developing. So that can be abnormal in children with depression, the adolescent stage, and then sleep disturbances. And then there's mixed results on inflammation in the body. A lot of evidence that people with depression have peripheral inflammation, but it's unknown if it's actually in the brain. That's why there's a question mark on that one. So those are kind of what your body can do to make you more predisposed to depression. Now the psychosocial, negative thought patterns, kind of dived into that. Neuroticism, early trauma or loss, isolation, learned behaviors, poor social support, family history of depression. These are just some of them. There's a lot of others that can go into what it means to have your mind thinking in ways that are unhelpful. I always have to, when I'm on the mental health unit, I have to lead a group therapy session there, and a lot of the times I just like list off these things that people do, and every single one of them, someone in the room is like, yeah, that's what I do. For example, catastrophizing. Oh, I had a bad encounter with that person doesn't want to be my friend, now I lost my only friend, I am so sad, I'm depressed, and I'm going to die alone. Like, it seems like ridiculous if you say it out loud, but a lot of people do that. A lot of people go, oh man, I have to be perfect around this person. If I upset them in any way, it's over. I lose all this. Another thing is not forgiving yourself for mistakes, expecting yourself to be perfect, and if you don't meet that perfection, beating yourself up over and over and over for that. Not very helpful when you are trying to, go about things, interacting with people. These are the kind of things that can predispose you to being depressed. So just a couple of examples. And then we're in a church. I was asked to talk about the spiritual aspects. It's pretty hard to get scientific data on this because that's not necessarily how we do research in the medical field. There is evidence that strong religious beliefs actually are a protective factor on depression. Whenever we're looking at depression, if we're getting to the point where we're thinking about suicide, we think about protective factors. It's generally if someone has strong religious beliefs, a lot of that says like, hey, it generally gives you support systems as, like a church body, or if you're in a synagogue or part of a religious group, that can be protective. The other parts are when we think about suicide, a lot of the religions say, probably not a good idea. So that's considered a protective factor against suicide. Now, not to say that religious people couldn't be suicidal. When we talk about protective factors, they're just things that generally help. Each case is different. So if we think about all those things that we talked about before, your biology, your environment, the way you think. So depression can still happen in religious people. And a lot of people can actually incorporate negative messages from religious backgrounds. So let's just say, for example, in Christianity, since we're in a church, you take the message that you are a sinner, going to hell, that's who you are, and you take that as your identity, as your core. That could be a pretty negative message if you don't, see the hope in the next part with but your sins are forgiven, you can come out of this, all that stuff. If you just incorporate that you're a bad person, that can, like we were talking about before, that's a negative thought pattern that can lead to, predispose you to depression. So, and then there's also generally, people know, like, there's a way that life is supposed to look, and there's the way that I'm living that doesn't look like that. For example, I thought families were supposed to be supportive, so why does every family member I have say bad things about me? That's just something we're meant to be have friends. Like, everyone has friends, but I don't have friends. So we generally know, like, this is the way ideally life would be. And there's times when our lives don't look like that. So that could be generally saying, like, oh, I'm not good enough, you can start incorporating negative thoughts about yourself during that. So if we think of it from a Christian's perspective, we're not living like we were meant to live. We're meant to live, in line with God, having that, like in the garden, basically. We're supposed to have that presence, be able to communicate with Him, be in His presence, have that strong community. And if we aren't living like that, what does that mean? That means that we can be negatively impacted by things. Sin does affect us in this world. Even if we are forgiven, it's not a one-time process. We're constantly going through the healing process of that. So if we aren't actively pursuing that, you can kind of let all these negative things start impacting you, can affect your mood, can lead to depression. There's a lot of misunderstandings about depression too. I've often heard, especially on the unit, oh, I'm a Christian, so I can't be depressed. Well, you're kind of on this unit, and we don't just, insurance companies definitely won't pay for people to just take a vacation here. You kind of made all these statements to your friends and family who you've talked to, so maybe you are, at least consider it. And then the Bible does acknowledge depression, anxiety, things like that. So I would say Job, like he's a great guy doing his thing, all this bad stuff happens, and then he starts talking kind of despairingly. I would say maybe he was a little depressed. And the other thing I like to think about is when it comes to the instruction manual, when we talk about the Bible, there's a lot of things that don't need to be said. You should breathe about, 16 to 20 times a minute so you can continue to oxygenate. That doesn't need to be said. You should eat about 3 times a day, to make sure that you're going to continue to survive. Those things don't need to be specifically stated, You don't have to do the obvious. So they only address things that people would need help with. If it's in the Bible, it's kind of like, okay, it exists, and here's a solution for it. So there's often times when it's written that, hey, you're going to experience this, but I can help you out. So Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves those crushed in spirit. If that's not a fancy way to say people are feeling depressed and low, I don't know what is. Yeah, and then there's anxieties. Oh, I shouldn't be anxious. Well, you probably are going to be anxious, since in the world there's a lot of troubling things. In fact, if you believe in the Bible, they do say you're going to experience troubles. Yes. So, he can help you out there by casting your anxieties. All who labor and are heavy laden, that sounds like depression can sometimes feel like a weight on you. And if it's another way. Brokenhearted, those crushed in spirit, like I said before. Oh, I think I could. Oh, I did copy it twice. That's okay. Psalm 102, 1 through 4. Prayer of one afflicted when he is faint and pours out his complaint before the Lord. So, you can read the rest of that, but day of my distress sounds like a pretty bad day. And then I like to always point out that when I read this in Paul, about Paul in 2 Corinthians, I always think, maybe he was actually suicidal. So we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. So, that could also just be like, oh man, life sucked, but that, at least when I see that, I'm like, red flag, red flag, red flag. Someone saying I despaired of life itself, that is a red flag for me. Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death, but then it made us rely not ourselves, but God who raises the dead. So, these things are almost expected. Let's just take I won't go into a specific patient to protect their privacy, so we'll just have a patient, we'll call her Jezebel, because I know no one's going to be named that here. We'll do Jezzy for short. I was like, I was originally going to do, let's do a girl named like Susie, but it was pointed out that we have some Sues in the crowd, so we'll go with Jezzy instead. So let's just say Jezzy, she's going about life, and all of a sudden, her parents are divorced. She really relied on the parents, felt very safe in their home. Parents are divorced all of a sudden. And they're like, oh, it's okay, our children are adults. Okay, so that's one thing. Be like, man, that's really knocking me down. Then she gets fired from her job. Then she's having trouble at home because they have financial difficulties. And then when she turns to support from someone, her friends are like, stop complaining. Get over it. Things like that. So all these things can lead to someone like Jezzy, even if she was normally functioning at a high level, could predispose someone to depression. And then if she doesn't know who to turn to, it can spiral worse and worse. So the point of that example is that it doesn't necessarily mean like, hey, that you're abnormal if you're having depression. These kind of things can happen in life. It doesn't even have to be something that other people do. It could just be car accident. Hurts, you lose your ability to walk. You can't do the things you normally did. You couldn't do your job. The things that you built your identity on are things that are suddenly taken away. Can I blame, like if I lost my ability to walk, I'd be depressed. I don't know about anyone else here, but I'd feel like, wow, what does life look like now? I did all these things that look like, you know, I was an active guy, I was able to walk around, and now life looks differently, and it's hard. And let's just say in that accident, I lost someone I love. That's another thing you have to deal with. So when people say depression is your fault, well, maybe some of the choices that you made led to that, but it could also just be something that sometimes life just happens. Another thing is, even if you did do poor decisions that led you there, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't be forgiven of that. A lot of people have struggled with this forgiveness. Oh, I did this and now I'm in this situation. A lot of times the people around you can help you move on, but if you don't have that support, it can be pretty hard to move on from that. That's something that we constantly emphasize to the patients on our units. Like, at certain points, it's either forgive yourself or you are going to end up taking your own life because of the guilt that's eating away at you. So it's important to consider these when you're dealing with someone who has depression or if you're thinking about it yourself. And there's certain things you'll have to go through to move beyond it. And this is the end of my presentation. And that's just the more scientific. So I understand we have time for questions. I know some things are going to be addressed in the by the other speakers, but is there anyone who has any questions about anything that I just presented on?
Can you say for debilitating specifically for African Americans, is it for like, is that just a status that is being labeled, or is it specifically for African Americans?
So for the sake of the recording, can you restate her question?
Yeah, so the question, so I mentioned earlier that Caucasians are more predisposed to depression, but it was more debilitating for African Americans. So African Americans are less likely to have a depressive episode, but I did want to point out that when they do have a depressive episode, it typically has more ramifications in their life compared to Caucasians. So I'm not going to necessarily interpret fully what that means, but that could be because they have less resources, things like that. Generally, African Americans have lower economic status than Caucasians generally. So there could be a lot of factors that go into that. But typically we find that when an African American has a depressive episode, it generally knocks them down more than a Caucasian person. Yes?
Are there any triggers or any signs from moving from depression to suicidal thoughts?
So the question was, how do you identify, or what are some of the signs that go from depression to suicidal thoughts? I do believe we do have someone who's going to talk specifically about suicide risk assessment, so I might defer that to them, so I don't steal too much of their material. But, I'll generally say that if someone even mentions it, talks about dying, and it's not in the context of grief as in, hey, I miss this person, I wish I was with them, I've been married for 40 years and now they're gone. That is generally something that we consider okay, but once you start going beyond that or starting to think about actions, things like that, people are more socially isolating, those are generally some things. But I'll let the suicide assessment discussion be the one to answer that fully. Yes?
Yes, unless it's being covered elsewhere, can you speak to the benefit of medication or how that is addressed in different types of situations?
I believe Dr. Y is going to discuss fully about treatment options. So, yeah. And generally, because I did mention all the different potential causes of depression, there's going to look different depending on what causes it, and it can look different at different life stages too. Sometimes therapy will be more important, sometimes medications will be more important, but it will be addressed later. So it's a good thing that this is so well organized that we have all these questions that will be answered in detail. Yes.
Okay, I don't know if this is appropriate right now, but this is hard for me to talk about. I have had two family members. My father's brother committed suicide.
Mm-hmm.
And then when my grandfather committed suicide, my aunt couldn't find it. So we were all there. She came up the stairs screaming her head off. And that's in my head, with her coming up the stairs, doing that. And it's like, I struggle with this.
Yeah, so I'm sure it'll be addressed in the suicide, but the statement was about kind of struggles with what happens if you have family members who have had suicide or have had struggled with severe mental illness, and that does, like I mentioned before, the environment and the genetics are both there that can really affect. So I encourage anyone who realizes that a lot of depression is coming to an understanding of what is causing these things and then addressing it in the appropriate therapeutic setting. So maybe at a bar with your friends, drinking might not be the appropriate therapeutic setting, but if you go to someone who, especially, and there's a lot of specialization in therapists actually, so those are things that I would encourage people who struggle with that and continue to struggle with that to address with a therapist, someone who's maybe specialized in that. And another thing with therapy, I've often heard with my patients, oh, I didn't like that one. It's like, well, that might not have been the therapist for you. So you should find someone who you connect with and feel comfortable sharing. Like I wouldn't share all my personal things with one friend who I, just watch sports with, but maybe with someone who I trust to do that. So that's something important to consider. But I would highly encourage people who do struggle with those kind of things, and thank you for sharing about that, is to find someone who has training in it to dive into that, and what are some coping skills, or what are ways that you can think about it, how they can help you to either move on or accept what happened and try to help you out with that. Yes.
Your slide said that 200 billion people,
No, dollars.
okay.
Yeah, we don't have 200 billion people in the world. Yeah.
$1 billion are going towards,
So it's the economic cost of depression. So that's treatment, and also like let's just say you're depressed and your work function is decreased. That has monetary consequences, things like that. Sorry, I interrupted, but.
no, I was just wondering, so because funds are being decreased towards like resources to help people,
Yeah.
and so there's a discrepancy there.
Yep. That's what I struggle with all the time. So, like the insurances hate paying for it. our medical friends generally don't, when I say medical friends, we're all in medicine, but the internal medicine people, for example, they don't really have to justify hospital stays after a heart attack as much. But when it comes to depression, I have to justify every 3 or 4 days, why are you still keeping this person here? Well, they're still saying that they want to kill themselves, or they're still psychotic, or they're still manic. So please pay for this hospitalization. And the compensation is not as good for treating psychiatric illnesses, even though they do have these consequences. So, these are the things we'll have to consider when you think about where you want your government to put the money into, where you want to put resources into. Because people think that just because it's in your head doesn't mean, I think that's a Harry Potter quote, actually. Just because it's in your head, Harry, doesn't mean that it isn't real. So some people tend to blow it off. It's like, oh, we know. And it's also kind of hard to understand why people can be depressed. In the heart, you can go, well, part of your heart died, so that's why you had a heart attack, versus depression, it's not, you can't really, even though you're not seeing the heart, you can't see it. So it makes it more difficult to get funding. But it's definitely something that, especially if it continues to get decreased, it will be a problem in the future. There's a great shortage of psychiatrists, therapists, psychologists, mental health treatment in general. We've had people in our emergency department, because our beds were full, staying for days before they can get into an inpatient setting. So, things to consider.
Will your slides be available?
I have no problem with people sharing my slides, so if you'd like to give it to people, that's fine with me.
You quoted some verses from the Bible. Can you, what is ESV?
English Standard Version.
Okay.
So the question was, what was ESV, which were from the Bible verses, and that's what it is. Yes.
Will you have literature or anything like that where people couldn't have come today?
So I don't have any specific handouts, but people are free to grab my... I think that everything's being recorded on an audio form, and then people can have access to my slides if they want. Yes?
I know a lot of people don't want to be diagnosed with depression because of the stigma, insurance. So the numbers are probably more than what you've got on your slide.
That's very well true. Yeah, it can be hard to accept that. And like I said, a lot of it is awareness and being okay with saying, hey, life knocked me down. But yeah, that's definitely a problem that we struggle with. People don't like taking meds because they think that means that they're crazy. But like I said, I would be depressed if some of the things that have happened to my patients happened to me. I would almost be worried about some people if they didn't express some depression with some of the things that happened in their life, and at least go through that low before returning back to normal.
Are you seeing an increase in depression with our society becoming faster, quicker, more isolated? Is there an increase?
So anecdotally, aka my opinion, yes, but I don't have necessarily the medical research to back that up, but I would say that. But I've also not been doing this as long as some of our other presenters, so you might want to ask them. But from what I've seen, I generally feel like, yes, there are things. If you have 1,000 Facebook friends, but no one you can really talk to, what's the point of those 1,000 friends? Or if you're constantly going from task to task to task and don't take any downtime, how can you ever recuperate? So generally, yes, but that's my opinion.
That would be my thinking, just because society's more complicated.
Yeah, and even in my time in our emergency, or in our program, I've seen generally more people are coming to our emergency department for help than average, but I've also heard that's because we have a good reputation, so. Humble brag for my program. It's a great program. Any other questions? Oh, all right. Well, thank you everybody for your attention.